Alright, this video is going to show you how I put together the pinhole camera that's included in this Instructable. Now to make this pinhole camera, the basic materials you really need is some foam board, some black construction paper, aluminum foil, some hot glue, obviously a hot glue gun, some device to cut the foam board with, a ruler, or some light colored pencil, and that's essentially it. Now you'll notice I really only have 4 patterns that I'm going to be using. And I chose this design because I've used all kinds of materials to make pinhole cameras. I've had students use shoe boxes, coffee cans, Pringles cans, you name it. Anything under the sun. Again, almost any object can be turned into a pinhole camera. But the problem is when you're trying to troubleshoot why a camera is not working, it's very difficult to do that in an efficient manner when every student has a different design. So I try to come up with a consistent design so that way I can help students if they're having issues. And this design works extremely well, and it's also very cost effective in case you're unable to fit it into your budget and you're requiring students to afford their own materials. So, as I said, there's really only 4 basic parts. However, if you look at the patterns, and I have included these patterns at the bottom of this first page of the Instructable, there's really only 4 parts. And some of the parts are traced more than once, but the key material for this pinhole camera is foam board, and this piece that I have here is 20 inches by 30 inches, and it can range anywhere from $1 to $5. Now I spent about $1.03 on this piece of foam board from a Dollar Tree store near me. Now it depends on where you live. You may not have a Dollar Tree, but some dollar stores do carry this foam board, and I highly recommend it because even though it's cheaper, it actually makes it easier to cut. Some of the more expensive foam boards have a wax coating. So what I'm going to do, to save time with cutting and to save material, because you should be able to get 2 cameras out of 1 piece of foam board, I'm going to trace each pattern so that they line up against the edge of the foam board. It minimizes the amount of cuts I need to make. It also minimizes the possible human error that I have when I'm making the cuts, because you want these cuts to be as straight as possible. So as you watch here in a second, when I speed up, I'm lining all the parts up edge to edge. Now you'll notice that I'm using black foam board. Now you don't have to use black foam board, but if you don't, you're going to have to invest in some black spray paint because you don't want the inside of your camera being a light color because light colors reflect more light. So that's why I'm using black. Now when you're cutting out the parts for your pinhole camera, it's very important that you have a sharp blade and you also have a nice straight edge that you can use to help guide the blade. As I tell my students, if these cuts are not straight, you're going to have trouble assembling your cameras. And this is important, especially since we're not using a laser cutter or some sort of CNC machine that's going to help us cut the parts out, or we're not 3D printing the camera. And I tell the students, like, look, you need to take some pride in this. Again, you will have more success with the camera if you take your time and make straight cuts. And if you look in this sped up video, I do that. I take my time making the cuts, even on a high speed, and I'm using a straight edge to not only help cut the parts, but it also protects my fingers a little bit, so in case the blade gets snagged in the foam board, it's not going to jump on me. And as you can see, I'm trying to make the cuts as straight as possible. And this foam board allows me to do that. Even though it's cheaper, I can make a lot smoother cuts. Now one of the patterns looks a little strange. I call it the picture frame pattern. And originally we used this pattern to trace and cut out 2 very large rectangles. So the largest rectangles that we cut. And in the video here you can see the ones I mean. Now what we're going to do is lay the same pattern on these parts, and we're going to trace the inside of the pattern. Now we're not going to cut this out. And I repeat, we're not cutting this out. This white rectangle is going to help us with the layout of our other parts. Previously, we traced and cut out 3 medium-sized rectangles, and those rectangles are roughly the same size as these shapes that I just traced. And that's the whole reason I trace them, is because that's going to help us lay these parts out so our camera goes together very snugly. We don't want it opening up very easily and letting light in. So as you can see, these parts line up almost exactly, and that will help us assemble our camera. Now, at this point, we're going to create the hole for the aperture. Now, the whole point of an aperture on a camera is it allows light to enter the camera so we can actually take a picture. So what we're going to do first is we want to find the center of this white rectangle we traced. And the easiest way to do that is to connect the corners by drawing lines. And in the center of this rectangle, where you essentially have your X, we're going to draw a small rectangle or square. And we're then going to cut that out just like we did the other parts. And this is later going to be covered with a piece of aluminum foil. Now we're going to start assembling the camera, but we're not quite done cutting yet. We're almost done. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take one of those 3 medium-sized rectangles and we're going to glue it on top of the hole we just cut out. And I'll tell you why in a second. This first piece that we're going to glue down is going to help us assemble one half of the camera. This medium-sized rectangle actually shows us where the other part should go. So when I'm gluing these parts down, you always want to go around the edge first, and then you want to make sure you use enough glue in the middle so the parts stay attached. If you don't use enough glue, especially with foam board, sometimes it starts to separate a little bit as we pull the halves of the camera apart. And you want to apply enough pressure, and you want to make sure the hot glue is hot enough, otherwise it'll cool too quickly and things won't adhere. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out that rectangle again, because essentially what you just saw me do is I just cut this really nice hole, and then I glued a piece of foam board over top of it. So I want to make sure that hole still exists, so I'm going to cut, now that the parts are glued together, I'm going to cut that hole out again. And as you can see, I now have a rectangular hole going through both pieces of foam board. It doesn't have to be pretty, because we're going to cover it up with aluminum foil, but you do want it to be as neat as possible. Now from here I'm going to speed things up. And you want to make sure when you assemble the camera that you use enough glue. So I'm going to assemble the back of the camera right now. And this part is where the film is going to go. And by stacking these 3 pieces of foam board together, it's going to create a nice light, tight seal. Now this is the front part of the camera. And I'm going to start by gluing the 2 small rectangles. So when you make sure you put enough glue, you want to hold them vertically for maybe 20 seconds so they stand. And then I'm going to take the hot glue gun and trace the edges of the camera. And I'm going to use my hands to clamp the pieces in place. This is very important. You want the pieces to be as straight as possible. You also, again, want to make sure you use enough glue or you'll have to have an additional step later. Now at this point, we're ready to install the aperture and shutter. Now the aperture is created by sticking a pin through a piece of aluminum foil. So I'm just going to cut a big rectangle of aluminum foil and tape it on all 4 sides so it's tight. I'm then going to cut a large rectangle out of the black construction paper, and I'm going to tape it on one side so it creates a hinge so students can lift it up to take a picture and close it to prevent light from entering. Now if you have gaps after you're done assembling this camera, you're going to want to get some black caulk to fill in those gaps so light doesn't come into your camera. But this is it. You're done your camera. Very, very simple.